All right, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for this presentation. So my name is Enoch Agyepong. I'm a cybersecurity researcher at Cardiff University, and my area of research is into security operations centers. So the objective of this research really is to investigate how to measure the performance of a cybersecurity operations center analyst. Please feel free to submit your questions as I go along in this presentation, and I'll allocate some time at the very end for Q&A sessions. Thank you. So Cybersecurity Operations Center really is a centralized location within an organization that help businesses to defend themselves against cyber attacks. And it's being used within both the public and private sector organizations. And the increased use of SOC has led to several studies on SOC, but there are some aspects of SOC that has not been fully investigated, and researchers advocate for research into those areas. And I think it's mainly to do with the human factor side of things, along with how to capture performance and also how to look into things like workload, analyst burnout. So those are areas that researchers advocate for more studies into it. But on this work, we're looking at currently how to improve existing assessment methods. So currently, there is a lack of adequate metrics for measuring analyst performance. There is also no systematic way of capturing the overall performance of analysts. And there is a lack of guidelines as well as to how to assess the quality of analysis that are typically carried out by the analyst. And one of the things that literature typically points out is the fact that among the existing metrics, analysts complains that it fails to take into consideration several aspects of their work. And the question is, what aspects of their work are not being taken into consideration? And this is a key to this research that we want to try and investigate. So there are a number of subjective and objective metrics that currently exist that analysts, typically SOC stakeholders, use to capture the performance of analysts. And I think the key one typically tend to be the use of time. So where a SOC stakeholder will use things like mean time to detect an incident, or time to respond to an incident, or time to triage an incident. The problem with, time has its advantages, but the problem with using time is the fact that it doesn't take into consideration the complexity of an incident or a number of factors that are outside the scope of analyst remit. So when you use time, for example, someone could be dealing with a very complicated incident, but then someone will be dealing with a benign activity, and he or she may end up getting a better time than somebody dealing with a complex incident. Other also metrics that exist are the use of cardinal numbers. Typically they use things like the number of incidents detected by an analyst in a SOC, or they use the number of incidents that has been closed by the analyst. Again, using numbers or cardinal numbers doesn't take into consideration alert priority, or the severity of an alert, or the complexity of the alert. It doesn't take into consideration. So someone may well raise one incident which has so much significance, but someone has been raising 10, which are benign activity, and they will end up on the scale as performing better than the person that have just done a complicated incident. Other metrics that also exist within SOC, when you look at the literature, are things like the use of quality analysis. The problem with using quality analysis is the fact that there are no guidelines as to how to evaluate such an analysis. And also, quality analysis itself is very subjective. So it's very difficult if there is no guidelines or there is no a benchmark for what that quality is. It's very difficult, becomes very, very subjective. And likewise, there is the use of quality of an analyst report, which again doesn't take into consideration the lack of guidelines to assess that. So that is where we want to focus to see whether we can come up with a better way of capturing the performance of analysts and to address the current problem, which I've just outlined. But then there is a problem to try and come up with a way to capture analyst performance. Currently, there is no agreement on what constitutes the main function of a SOC analyst. And the proposed argument in this study is that analyst overall performance could be captured if there is a common agreement on their functions upon which their performance should be based. So once we set out and we have an agreement on what their main functions are, we could then come up with a way to aggregate their performance to be able to get their holistic effort within a security operations center. And given that there is a lack of consensus on their main function, this study starts off by setting out or outlining what the main functions are to be able to propose a solution to the current problem. And to actually solve the problem that I've just outlined, the overall research methodology being adopted here is the design science approach. And design science allows us to create some form of an artifact to solve a practical or organizational problem, which in this instance is a security operations center that lacks adequate metrics. And it sets out, design science sets itself out in 5 key stages where you identify the problem, you make a suggestion, you develop a solution, evaluate it, and you end up with your conclusion. The beauty of using design science to solve this practical problem we've identified is the fact that it allows you to also integrate other methods. So as you can see in the paper that we've submitted, we actually use case study within design science during the problem exploration and also the evaluation of the artifact that is being created. And again, artifact really is a man-made object to solve a practical problem. So we used case study in the construction of our artifact and through the design science process. So during the first stage of the design science process, typically you go through various iterations. So rarely is your first iteration the final solution. And in the first iteration of the research process, we did a systematic literature review to try and identify any form of framework, SOC framework or model that could be used as the roadmap to build a comprehensive framework to capture the overall performance of analysts. And based on the literature review that we did, the systematic literature review that we did, we identified 3 key materials. The first one was by Shinigal, the second one was by Obubinko, and the third one was by Liffey and Somerstead. And at the end of the first phase, the first iteration of the design science process, 2 key artifacts were produced, which was the construct and also the conceptual framework. And a construct really denotes the vocabularies that are used within the problem space, so within the SOC, the functions, and how participants or the people that work within the SOC see their functions and how they should be measured. And also the conceptual framework that came out of the first iteration. And we then did a comparison between the frameworks and the model that we identified. And this table is a work that was taken from Majid and Arifa. They actually did a comparison between the work that was done by Obubinko and by Shinigal on the framework for building a SOC. And I think I just want us to focus on the very last row, which is the functions of a SOC. As you can see, there is a clear difference between how Shinigal sees SOC functions and also how Obubinko sees the functions of a SOC. And when you look at the work that Obubinko did, he actually look at things like, again, monitoring functions, but it doesn't actually capture it within the main framework that he presents. And there are clear differences. So, I mean, going with this framework, it is self-evident that unless you have a consolidated or you have a complete picture, overall picture of what a SOC does, any form of approach that you introduce to try and capture the performance of analysts will suffer from the current problem, which doesn't take into consideration their overall performance. So this really is to try and have a full, complete picture of what a SOC does. And that, as you can see, have the different functions. The other model that was identified was the model that was proposed by Liffey and Somerstead. And this model really look at the operations of IDS operators. And as they acknowledge in their paper, an IDS operator really is a subset of what a SOC does. So we felt it's wise to integrate, again, to look at this model and look at the functions that will be done by an analyst and bring it in to what the frameworks that has been proposed by other researchers. So the consolidation of the current frameworks and the model produces this table, and it sets out the different functions that a SOC may offer, the different functions and services. But the problem is this the complete package? Is it everything that a SOC offers, or are there more? And if there is, we need to also establish which of these functions belongs to analysts. Whether analysts are expected to do every single function, or whether they are expected to do a subset. Because of the way it's been described in literature, different experts have different opinion on what the functions of a SOC analyst should be. So to actually get to the bottom of it and identify what the functions of an analyst should be, we did a ground truth, and we visited a SOC and spoke to a number of SOC analysts and SOC experts to try and get understanding of what their functions are and areas that needs to be taken into consideration to capture their overall performance. So we visited various SOCs. We visited 5 SOCs across different industries. Visited Ministry of Defense, a defense SOC, a finance SOC. Again, we visited telecommunications SOC, automobile SOC, and engaged with different stakeholders, SOC managers and analysts, to have understanding of what they actually do. And what came out was this conceptual framework, in a way how participants see their functions and what they call the core functions, the secondary functions, and things that are done by the SOC but falls outside the remit of an analyst. So these 11 functions signify what we deem as the global SOC functions. And the argument is that any organization that claims to offer a SOC service will have one of these functions. And this was actually confirmed by the participant that engaged within our study. We've tried to use color coding to try and make we set it out a bit clearer in terms of how we explain the different functions and how participants see themselves performing it. And as you can see, some of the constructs that are being used over here really reflect the frameworks that we build this conceptual framework on. But participants really see some of these functions. So for example, the green function signifies the core functions, the areas that SOC analysts see as pivotal. They see it as foundational. And any SOC really needs to offer these 3 functions: the monitoring and detection function, analysis function, and response function. And what was interesting was that participants, made it clear that any assessment method needs to take into consideration these 3 key components. The red functions really signifies those that are performed by SOC, but they are outside the remit of an analyst. So things like penetration testing, although that will be done by a SOC, participant made it clear that an assessment method should not be based on penetration test function, because that's a specialist thing done by a penetration tester. Likewise, forensic and malware analysis are outside the scope of the work that a SOC analyst may do. And again, there is the log collection function, which, as we saw, had Olubinko reported on. But log collection function, participant described, falls within the remit of SOC engineer or a solution architect. The blue functional areas are those functions that participants see as secondary. So in essence, those are the functions that may or may not be done by an analyst. And participant says that an assessment method should take those into consideration, but it should be flexible enough to allow a SOC to adapt it if those functions are being offered. At the red dotted line at the very top shows how the key or the core functions of an analyst has been set out, that you have the monitoring detection function that would then lead you into a response activity depending on what you see during the monitoring detection activity. But underpinning that is your analysis function. So analysis function drives the operation at the very at the core of a SOC. when it comes to KPIs or metrics for capturing the performance of analysts, 3 areas we identify. We have the quality-based metrics, the quantity-based metrics, and the time-based metrics. But based on the analysis of data using thematic analysis, it was evident that all the participants agreed that the analysis of a SOC analyst should be the center of any assessment method. And participants advocate that when it comes to assessing their performance, it should be based on the quality of their analysis and the quality of their report, rather than the use of things like the time it takes them to respond to an incident or the time it takes them to resolve an incident. So they want their metrics to be based on the quality of their work. So that brought us to the very end of iteration 1, where we had that conceptual framework, having a common agreement on the areas that needs to be taken into consideration to capture the performance of an analyst. The next phase of this work is iteration 2 of the design science process, which will entail the expansion of the conceptual framework. Is an improved version of that framework. And the objective of that will be to identify metrics and measures within each of the key functions and map them, and also to have a focus group session with SOC analysts and SOC experts to see whether there is a way that we can model their operations within a SOC and come up with a systematic way of capturing their overall performance in a SOC. And that brings me to the very end of this presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you.